Hi, XDemp. This is Anshul. I'm one of your captains. So this lecture, I know it's a bit late. I had some problems, me with technology. Basically, today we're going to be covering the Middle East. We're going to start off with Israel, Palestine. What we're going to do is we're going to start off with the history. We're going to look at what's really been going on in the conflict. And then we're also going to look at what the current day issues are, what's currently been happening on both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, the current government organizations, who are the people you need to know, the numbers you need to know. And then we're going to go into the actual, what I believe with my research is the number one way to deal with this conflict. So yeah, after that, of course, we're going to go into other civilizations. I'm going to do a quick touch up on ISIS, so you already covered that before. We'll go with ISIS, talk about Libya, because that place under a little bit of issues right now. We're going to talk a little bit about the Arab Springs. For those of you who don't know what the Arab Springs occurred in 2013, started in Tunisia. Massive chain of democracy that occurred across the Middle East. We're going to talk about that a little bit, how that's influencing current politics. We're going to talk about Yemen. That's something the U.S. also really wanted to talk about, Yemen, and basically what does that mean? What are the geopolitical issues there? Who is really the good guys, perhaps, because you're thinking about currently the government that's currently in power in Yemen, and then currently the Shia Houthi rebels who are trying to liquidate that government. So we're going to cover those topics as well. Finally, we're going to finish off this lecture with the Iran, the nuclear deal. There will be a separate video on nuclear weapons, nuclear treaties, the NPT, all that fun stuff, NATO. But till then, we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia, Iran, what basically their alliances are, what does that mean, and then how the rest of the Middle East factors into that as well. We'll also talk about Turkey, and if we have some time, we'll talk about Syria as well. So let's get started. So today we're going to be discussing mainly. We'll start off with Israel. So Israel is actually surprising to most people. Is that it's actually a fairly new country compared to some of the larger countries in the world today, such as the United States, which is over 240 years old, while Israel was only born in the 1950s. Now, the reason we have to understand Israel is that of the current day conflict in Israel between the Palestinian territories. Palestine, just to you guys are able to reference it correctly, Palestine is recognized by the United Nations as an observer state. It holds an observer standing in the United Nations General Assembly. It is not part of any other committees other than the General Assembly. It has access. Certain nations agree to its existence, certain nations don't agree to its existence. Currently, Israel is stating that Palestine should basically it doesn't really recognize its existence. The U.S. is currently pro-Israel. Just some things for you guys to understand in that regard. Palestine encompasses of two main areas. We are talking about the West Bank and then Gaza. Surprisingly, they're actually on the opposite side. West Bank is to the east of Israel and Gaza to the west. Gaza's to the west, yes. Also, we're going to talk about a little bit about the heights. I can never get the name right exactly, but we're going to talk about those heights for a while because that is kind of important with the current conflict of Israel. The Golan Heights, my bad. Sorry, I have this on PowerPoint. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Golan Heights and what occurred. So let's start off. We're going to talk about first about Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the idea of the Jewish state. Now we're going to start off with talking about Abraham. Most of us have learned in our history classes that Abraham was considered, he was supposedly a real man, who was known as the first prophet of God, which is the idea of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish God, this singular monotheistic entity that supposedly created the world in 7 days, governs our existence, blah, 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 blah. But basically, he was the first. The Jews were actually the first of the religions of the book, as Muhammad said. You had first the Jews, then you had the Muslims, then you had the Christians. Um, yeah. No, that's wrong. I don't know. Okay, so I'm gonna skip that part. I'm gonna cut that part out. Okay, basically, what Jews believe is that God stated to Abraham that this land, the land of the Palestine, the current area under conflict, this is a land for your people. This idea came into much larger prominence during the 1950s when many Jews started not segregating, emigrating into the area of Palestine. However, we had to look at why they started immigrating, because surprisingly, most people, anti-Semitism is not simply something which occurred during the time of Hitler with the SS, the Gestapo, and the concentration camps such as Auschwitz and Birkenau. Actually, anti-Semitism has been happening for a quite long time. It started off with the early Romans. It happened with started actually also with the Egyptians, as we all know the story of Moses. He led the exodus of his people, and the Ten Commandments, blah 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 blah. Then, of course, the Romans also burnt down Jerusalem. They attacked it. That's why only the west wall is left in the city of Jerusalem, instead of the entire building. So the Romans were pretty brutal to the Jews. We also have the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, who were in power for quite a long time. Not just in the 1950s. They're actually in power for a while. The Ottoman Turks, they had a lot of issues with the Jews, and a lot of it was in Eastern Europe. Even Western parts of Western Europe were heavily anti-Semitic. And what we were getting at this is that anti-Semitism was a deeply ingrained part of Europe's history, and thus, even after World War II, seeing the terrors that occurred in World War II, one thing you have to realize that the terrors of World War II, the Holocaust, the concentration camps, the deaths, the SS, the Zyklon B gas, all that, it wasn't really. Many people didn't accept it at first. Many nations weren't really sure about what they were seeing. It took a while for the trials to happen. They tracked down some, and only a little bit after that, people really started to get what was going on. And meanwhile, the Soviet Army, the Red Army, under the control of Joseph Stalin, and the Soviet Union, came from the east, and then the Allied forces, consisting of the United Kingdom, France, and the United States of America, came in from the west. Their goal was to cut off Berlin, and on the way they would free many. They would liberate many of the, and eventually all of the concentration camps that the Nazis had set up, such as in places such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Germany. So, but when this happened, is the Jews were kind of left to be on their own, because many countries, because anti-Semitism didn't really want them coming into their countries. They didn't really weren't really accustomed. Immigration became very tough for Jews trying to get into the United States of America. Same for other parts of Europe. Many of their homes were destroyed. Many places didn't want large communities of Jews. They started setting up small communities, basic living necessities, basically concentration camps, but they weren't being tortured and killed on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, the Jews were not really welcomed by their European neighbors, and because of that, they basically had this idea of Zionism. After they were free from the liberation camp, people would go to the area of Israel and Palestine, and basically started settling there. So they pretty much struck their roots in the four holy cities of Judaism, which were Jerusalem, Tiberias, Hebron, and Safed. Not sure if I said that's right, but basically that was the idea that they were going with, and they basically tried to stay there for a while, but the British let them stay there. They're actually in a very low concentration comparing to what was happening before then. There are only about 30,000 Jews there compared to what there is now, so they were actually quite a minority group. However, what occurred is that after World War II, British found itself in really fierce conflict with the Jewish community, and also with the Arab community that was there, which supported the Palestinians. So, on May 15th, 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations, they created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. Their job was basically to go out and try to see what was going on in the system. They wrote a 143-page report that they reported back to the General Assembly and the Security Council. And what their findings showed is that it was a very weird situation. So this goes into exactly what constituted what occurred in Israel. So a couple of things happened. First, many of the Jews, they started buying lots of land from their Arab neighbors. They started buying lots of land. So that area basically started creating into little areas as part of their nation state. They tried to bring that together, make that into its own nation state. So then on 3rd September 1947, after the report, the UN General Assembly proposed that in order to, they would revoke Britain's control of the mandate of Palestine from the League of Nations, and instead make it an independent Arab state, an independent Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem. So on November 29th, November 1947, the General Assembly adopted a resolution for the first of many partition plans that would try to divide up this area. And in this first part, it was actually very, very generous, the partition plans. It was giving only a very small chunk of the area for the Jewish people, and actually a large chunk for the Arabs. However, the Palestinians. But what occurred that the Arab League, if you don't know who they are, they're some of the bigger cousins of the Middle East area, such as Iran, Jordan. These countries, Egypt, they refused to accept the idea that the Jewish could come in here and take this area, and they immediately rejected the partition plan, that they would refuse any partition. And so basically what happened then is on December 1st, 1946, and this stuff moved very fast because it was a very important issue, the Arab Higher Committee of the Arab League proclaimed a 3-day strike, and a lot of Arab sort of militia groups started attacking a lot of Jewish people, and this was like the first of the civil wars that occurred in the area. And there was a whole bunch of stuff, but actually what happened here was that the Jews actually ended up winning, and almost 250,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from the area of Palestine that was now soon forming into the area of Israel. So this was the first issue. This is the first time it came together. That on May 14, 1948, a day before the expiration of the British Mandate, as stated by the United Nations, the head of the Jewish Agency, which was like kind of like a little authority that they'd set up to basically state their stake for Israel, he basically established that this state will be known as Israel. However, the exact next day, that means on 15th May 1948, this is a very important date to remember. Most people do know it. It's 15 May 1948. 4 different armies of the Arab League waged war against the Israelis, and this basically cemented Israel's claim to being a nation state when they defeated these enemies. That's right, Israel, a new country, managed to hold off all of these enemies by itself. Now that you can take that any way you wish, but these countries were Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq, and they launched the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Multiple other groups such as Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, they all joined the conflict trying to drive out these, what they called those invaders, into their area. They kept trying to kick them out, but eventually the Jews won. A year fighting later, ceasefire was declared, and basically Jordan, it was Transjordan back then, but Jordan as we know it now. And next, became known as the West Bank. If you guys don't know, that's actually on the east. Well, naming. That include East Jerusalem and then Egypt to control of the Gaza Strip. So also during this time, there was a lot of anti-Palestinian sentiment going around in Israel after this conflict, a lot of anti-Arab sentiment, and what they did is that 700,000 Palestinians were actually kicked out of this area, and that's what caused a lot of anger and a lot of hate that occurred in this area. So what happened next is that a lot of people started growing, a lot of people started coming into Israel. It rose from the 30,000 I told you last time to almost 2 million people between 1950s and 1958, or 1940s to 1958. So that was a lot of people that ended up coming in to the nation, which is actually insane since that means more civil conflicts are beginning to happen, because Israel, if you guys have never seen, is a very small land in comparison to the amount of people who are now entering in, and because of this, they began a huge amount of there was a lot of civil conflicts that were happening between the Palestinians that were there and the Israelis, so that became a big problem. Then in the 1960s, something very important happened in 1967. This is one of the 1967 borders. Is that Israel, for once, what happened is the Arab League refused to recognize Israel, as I said before, called for its destruction, blah, blah, blah. Israel-Arab relations had massively deteriorated because of these conflicts. Peacekeepers were getting in. UN peacekeepers were coming to station themselves in 1957. They were basically having all these conflicts, which eventually led to Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, the same people who caused the 1948 war. And in the Six-Day War, Israel really established itself as a massive organization. They basically took over all this land of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, all this area was like, other than that, those areas, like the majority of Israel was taken over by them. And this is really where the biggest part of the conflict rides from. That's actually, was this the territory taken during this war legal? Was it just what occurred here? And was it also, some say that they overestimated what they deserved, what they overestimated what they had actually earned, and this is really where the conflict starts. So there are a few days you guys need to remember. I'm just gonna go over it. First thing is, anti-Semitism is prevalent throughout Europe, even today, even the back way then, to the Romans, the Ottomans, all that stuff. Next thing you guys need to understand is the British Mandate of Palestine that was given in 1922 by the League of Nations to UK. That basically allowed the Israelis to get there. Then right before the mandate basically was kicked out, the UN tried to suggest a partition plan. Didn't happen. Instead, the guy who was in charge of the Jewish Assembly in 1950 established the Jewish state. And immediately they were 1948, sorry, they went to war. What happened in the war is that Israel had managed to hold off its offenders, 4 different nations plus multiple other Arab nations. Then what happened is in 1967, basically the Middle East was calling for its destruction of Israel. They didn't believe it that able to exist, and that's when basically Israel went and launched a massive military expansion. Like all these areas that were annexed by Jordan and Egypt, these were basically taken back. The Golan Heights was still an area under a bit of consideration, which is currently in the control of Jordan. That was still something which had not been completely revamped, but the West Bank and Gaza Strip were basically, according to Israel, that they became its territories. It became its control after it won the war. And that's basically what its stake is now. So, let's talk about West Bank and Gaza, specifically my favorite guy, Benjamin Netanyahu. So, if you don't know who Benjamin Netanyahu is, he was the Prime Minister of Israel. He somehow did manage to win this time in the Knesset. He is the Prime Minister again of Israel for a little bit. He is very conservative. He's far right as a politician. Actually, 2 weeks before the elections were about to close, he was lagging the polls. He immediately called for the destruction of Palestine. Now, multiple political scientists believe that this is simply a ploy to get himself elected, and he probably will not be arguing for the destruction of Palestine, but he is incredibly pro-Israel. If you look at the party system of Israel, a lot of the ideas of party system, like you don't just have one central Zionist party. You have multiple parties that argue to a different level of Orthodox Judaism or Zionism or some concept like that. Basically, is what decides the party. So it's very, very conservative there. So that's where this is coming from. What happened is that Israel has settlements, or Israeli citizens had settlements within these areas of Gaza and the West Bank. And basically, the Palestinian organization, the UN, saw them like, "Yo, bring these settlements back," and Israel was like, "Nah, we won't." The Palestinians, if you know about the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, they were actually the ones who do all this stuff. Basically, like the organization that represents Palestine, that's considered the main government. They were with Hamas. They are with Hamas. They do not agree with terrorism as a whole, but they do use Hamas as certain ways. There were a lot of human rights claims on both sides, rockets being fired, there were a lot of propaganda, a lot of pictures being shown like hospitals blowing up. Something which really accelerated this all was the U.S. The U.S. got involved because it wanted an ally in the Middle East. If you guys remember, it was when we were pretty small, I'd say around 2005. There were some conflicts with oil going around when in Israel. It's when we were very young, but that was also something that happened. The U.S., of course, as we all know, loves oil, so it got involved in there, set up some stuff. It also set up the Iron Dome defense system, and this irritated a lot of its Arab neighbors because it showed the U.S. was militarily financing Israel. And what the Iron Dome missile system is basically a set of, it's actually a program. It's just like everything these days, it's CompSci. What it does is it tracks enemy targets and then it's able to fire using U.S. rocket launchers. Just these big, like, rocket launchers, and have like 9 rockets that you can like fire, and as an anti-ballistic method to take out enemy rockets coming from Palestine. And this was a big issue for parts of Palestine. Another thing that happened is after all these ground invasions, there's a lot of things that happened. 3 Israeli boys were found to be killed by Palestinians. This launched a lot of outrage among the Israeli folk. Palestinians started stating a lot of things. Israel started saying that the Palestinians were using human shields. There's going to be a lot of conflict, a lot of name calling that was going on. Eventually what happened is Netanyahu broke. He organized in last year, I believe. Last year. He authorized military strike in the last summer. He authorized a military strike that basically lasted for about 50 days, where they went right over to ground offensive and they went in and tried to take over the Palestinian area. And that's basically where our story ends. So we are looking at Israel-Palestine that is not simply a small conflict. It's a decades-long conflict that is because of multiple proxies. Israel, I will admit, has had its plethora of problems. The Jews have had a lot of problems in their past, many of them which they are not to blame for, simply because of racism within early European history. But this problem is not simply going to end by either extinguishing the Palestinians or extinguishing the Israelis. This is the first thing we're going to learn about for the extent part of this, is that we simply cannot kill off any organization. It's not intelligent for the international community. It is not at all a good idea to try to consider that you can only have one state. That's the first thing I want you guys to be advocating for when you're giving your speeches, that we are going to be advocating for a 2-state solution. Now, the question comes, where does that solution come from? So there are a couple issues that are dealing with this. Again, we already talked about the Arab League, which is highly against partition. It's easing up now a little bit, especially now it's a very ripe time because big players in the league, Iraq, Syria, Iran, they're going much more, Syria is not as much progressive, but Iraq is trying a little bit. Iran, still not that much, but basically, all these countries are in a bit of conflict right now. They're more willing to give up some stuff in the exchange for Western aid. So right now it's a good time to be able to try to get a partition plan out of them. Now the question comes, what are the borders? So you have some options. We can go with the 1948 borders, which were stated that they were a very, very small chunk, about 70. Then halfway in between, I think around 1951 and 1952, there was a partition plan which go 50-50. That was really weird. It was like this, like if you ever look at a cow, like the way the spots are, they had like one spot was Palestine, then one spot was Israel, and then another spot was Palestine. So that one was a bit weird. Don't go with that. The current day we're going with is 1967, which basically Israel owns everything other than the Golan Heights, Gaza, and the West Bank. And the only reason we have to go with this partition plan because it's all that Israel will agree to, and the Palestinians need to have some area. We need to basically first broker a ceasefire, and then we need to ensure that we can keep UN peacekeepers. Because second thing is that these borders are incredibly blurred. Even when the C7 borders were created, they weren't extremely well defined. What counted as Gaza, what counted as West Bank. So we need to make sure that these borders are well defined, that people understand what they mean. This comes into the idea of UN peacekeeping forces, who are meant to stay, you give them a mandate. I've talked about this before. You give them a mandate and they basically stay in an area and execute that mandate. So that way you have relatively non-unbiased international coalition support, while also keeping it less of a non-violent area. And the next thing we have to do is get rid of Hamas. We need to have radicalism taken on both sides. The Zionists need to calm their jets. Hamas needs to stop. Pretty much, like, we need to find a way to stop Hamas, because Hamas is doing a lot of human rights abuses there, which are fueling a lot of the conflicts. They are doing a lot of human rights abuses to Israel, which of course Israel will retaliate for. So because of that, that is a very important thing that we must discuss and make sure about. So yeah, wrapping up Israel, basically a partition plan. I choose 7 boards because there's nothing really that's more easy to understand. It's mainly for pragmatism. Finally, we have the Benjamin Netanyahu. You should know him. He is going to be in the Knesset for a few more years. He was actually lagging in the polls, but he's back. He is incredibly conservative. He supports Israel, but remember, like I said, partition plan is not going to work. So yeah, that's Israel and Palestine. Next thing we're going to move on to is going to be something cool. Okay, bye. Okay guys, welcome back. So now we're going to be talking about ISIS. So, if you don't know what ISIS is, I'm not really sure where you've been these last few days. ISIS is the, well, as they like to call themselves, IS, Islamic State. I don't prefer to use Islamic IS because that legitimizes them as a nation state. I don't like that, so I'm going to call them ISIS throughout this. But what they basically argue is that they're creating a government, the caliphate. We talked about this last time when I covered ISIS, but basically, yeah, they're bad. They're going around practicing a very extreme version of Sunni induced Sharia law, and there are anyone who they believe is a heretic, anyone that's Christian, Hindu, Jew, any other type of Muslim for that matter, Buddhist, anything like that that's not a complete copy of the Sunni ideals that they're following, or even more radical, they will kill them. They're killing women, children, all sorts of people. So what currently is going on is ISIS is losing, which is a great thing. Like, high five. ISIS is losing. I'm happy. I'm so happy to give you guys this news. Last time I talked to you guys about this, I was talking about how, we're doing airstrikes, not that effective, not really getting anywhere. But now finally Syria's forces, Iraq's forces are able to get off the ground, and they're actually getting some stuff done. We've taken over Tikrit, one of the largest cities in Iraq. Currently, the U.S. Federal government's currently working with Iraqi and Saudi Arabia troops to eventually take Mosul, which is basically the stronghold. Actually, ISIS came from Al Qaeda in Mosul. That's where they were an offshoot of. That is Al Qaeda in Mosul. So this is really good news. However, they are spreading. They've gotten into Libya a little bit. They're expanding a little bit. We also have a very interesting phenomenon that's going on, that a lot of foreign fighters are now going to ISIS. We've detained quite a few people to the UK who are trying to leave. The US has had some problems as well, even especially now, this last week or so that I've been filming this. We're seeing a lot of terror plots that are being brought to court. Some of these could use a bit more evidence, I feel, on some of the cases. Could just be because of wartime panic, but basically the government's coming in and saying this guy is guilty of these charges, and they're charging everything from teenagers in Australia to old ladies in Belgium to a man in the US. Like, a lot of people are being charged for high punishments and high crimes because of things like, because the fact that they're simply trying to support a terrorist organization. And so not claiming alone, they have very high punishments. Also, something very interesting to look at is the Tisnarov case, because I feel this mirrors the U.S. concept of terrorism quite well right now. If you look at how efficiently, well, not efficiently, but how it was executed. Let's look at the case. So, the lawyer for Tisnarov, the lady, she was considered to be a quite good lawyer, of course, but there was something very interesting about the way her defense statement was made. She immediately went to the court and said, yes, my client is guilty of all the deaths, all the destruction, running from the police, murder. It's all true. But, this but is very interesting of hers. She says, but it's not his fault. It's only his brother's. If it wasn't for his brother, this wouldn't have happened. That is our entire defense. Now, if you usually think about terrorism cases, the idea is that you don't even prove your client guilty of terrorism, because the instant you say, "Yeah, judge, my client killed people in the name of radicalism," they probably won't be getting a very light sentence. So this shows kind of how terrorism is being thought of now in America. The people are becoming much more 9/11-ish towards the ideas of terrorism. We're becoming much more conservative. We're becoming much more hard-hitting on these concepts. It also showed actually that there's a spike in people who are now supporting the Patriot Act, which of course establishes the NSA spying program. So that may also be something to keep track of. So yeah, that's pretty much my recap for ISIS. Of course, if you've not seen my first lecture, feel free to let me know. I will be more than happy to talk to you about it, getting up to speed. So yeah, that's ISIS. So let's move on to some more fun stuff. I say fun. ISIS, we're going to go on to Syria. So Syria, if you guys don't remember, is currently a government owned by, I would say, is a dictator. Syria is south of Iraq. They're actually also dealing with the ISIS problem. Syria is the only ground army and other than the Iraq forces that are currently fighting ISIS. However, damn you, Bashar al-Assad. He was found to there's the allegations that they're using chemical weapons again. Lots of them. Sarin gas, VX nerve agent, lots of fun stuff. So if you guys don't remember what happened last time, Damascus, it was found that he was using nerve agents and sarin gas against people in Damascus, the capital of Syria. The UN launched this massive thing. Apparently, a lot of chemical weapons were destroyed. We were all happy, but apparently it didn't happen. What can you expect? It's Syria. So yeah, keep track of that. That's very, very important that you guys make sure you understand what's going on there. So that's Iraq and Syria. Let's go on to the Arab Spring. So if you guys don't know what the Arab Springs was, it happened in 2013, 2014. The idea of the Arab Springs was the idea of democracy. A lot of these ideas came after the fall of Gaddafi. If you guys don't know who he is, Colonel Gaddafi was the leader of Libya. He basically, the government, not really government, but a group of rebels basically brought him down, and a lot of democratic ideas started spreading around, which is great. But, so it started off with a guy in Tunisia, a vendor who set himself on fire, basically proclaimed that he wanted democracy. A lot of other governments soon took suit. However, what we're seeing now is that a lot of these governments are beginning to fail because of the fact is that in order to set up a democracy, you need to make sure that you have a stable way to vote. This occurred in Nigeria as well. We'll do Africa in a different lecture, but this occurred in Nigeria as well, where the elections between Goodluck Jonathan and his competitor were incredibly tense, and they were incredibly wrought with perils and disasters, such as bomb threats, actual bombs going off. If you guys have ever followed the Indian elections, you would know that this occurs in India as well. Politics is a very dangerous game to play there because there are lots of death, a lot of chaos that occurs. It's one of the problems we're seeing in the Middle East and the Arab Springs revolutions, that a lot of these governments aren't in the position and aren't in the infrastructure ready to actually carry out democratic government. A lot of the population is also very damaged after many civil wars. And this is really a problem that we're seeing with the Arab Spring. So this is something to keep in mind, that you guys need to make sure you're following the after effects of the Arab Springs, because it's still affecting us and it's still something very important to keep track of. So yeah, that was my piece on Libya and Gaddafi and that fun guy. Libya is actually in complete destruction. There are two different coalitions trying to fight for control of the city, the capital of Libya. There is no actual clear government, no coherent organization that currently has control of the area, and this is something that's very important to understand, that Libya is one of the worst examples of a nation right now inside the Middle East because it has no functioning government. Okay, so a lot of you guys were asking me about Iran. Not Iran, Yemen, my bad. A lot of you guys are asking me about Yemen. So, first things first, let's talk about geography. So, if you guys know where Saudi Arabia is, the really crappy rectangle I drew last time, but basically, my own jokes. Basically, the Red Sea here, you have the Indian Ocean, like here-ish, and you have Saudi Arabia, like a little box. That's the Arabian Peninsula. On top is Saudi Arabia, and below there are two countries. The first, the first one here is Yemen, and the one over here, I believe it starts with an A. Whoops. Yeah, Oman. Yeah, whoops. It's so here is Yemen. Yemen's here, and this is Oman. So these are basically the three nations that currently reside in the area. Now, Yemen is interesting because if you don't know about Saudi Arabia is a heavily Sunni government. It's a heavily Sunni government. They have very Sunni ideals, just like if you think about Iran, is very Shia, or Syria is very Sunni. So a lot of these countries were formed along these sectarian lines. Because of this, Yemen is also currently ruled by a Sunni government. They have a Sunni majority. However, recently, about a few months ago, 2015, Shia Houthi rebels. Now, let's talk about the Shia Houthi rebels. Shia, as we already discussed, they are a separate branch of Islam who believe in different things. We're not going to get into that right now. But they basically staged a coup d'etat against... if you don't know what a coup d'etat is, Google, first of all, a 1979 coup d'etat of Iran. Second, 1967, I think. But second of all, a coup d'etat is basically you try to destroy a government from the inside using propaganda. You try to take out the government leader or assassination, lots of fun stuff. Basically, the Shia Houthis are trying to do a coup d'etat against the current Sunni government. The presidential palace has been completely bombed. Shia Houthi rebels are taking care of was shelled. The capital was shelled. What they started off with is that the guy who was the Sunnis who were in charge of the Yemen government, they were actually willing to do some stuff to be able to actually get some peace going on. They were actually going to create a new constitution, part of the whole Arab Springs thing. However, the Shia Houthis, they kidnapped the guy who was supposed to take the constitution to the actual hall. And they basically held him. I forget if he got killed or not. But that basically started a lot of stuff. The Shia Houthis then came in. They started attacking the city. The government troops fell quite rapidly. Eventually, the government was seen officially declaring the liquidation of the government. They surrendered. Right now, however, we are going to care more about the international conflicts about what's going on. Because we got the small little baby of Yemen and the Shia Houthi rebels. Two small sides. But if any of you guys have ever studied the Cold War, or anything really that has to do with the US and Russia, you know about proxy conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Come on, you know this stuff. So, proxy conflicts. We got two big boys. Saudi Arabia, who we talked about, and Iran. Wonderful Iran. Great relations with the US. Iran. So yeah, you have Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, I said before, Iran is Shia, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. Now, if you guys can do a bit of matching, you can see that Saudi Arabia supports its bros in Yemen. Shia, Iranians, they're all for their brothers who are part of the Shia Houthi rebels. So, there's a lot of international allegations. This is big stuff, not just like me, a conspiracy theorist sitting here in front of a computer and talking to a bunch of high schoolers. No, there are international organizations that are openly calling out the Iranian government and basically claiming that it's supporting the Shia Houthi rebels. However, they've only said that they're supporting humanitarian aid. But they claim that they're doing airstrikes, they're doing helping train the troops, that they're doing massive amounts of help to the Shia Houthi rebels to try to bring down the Yemen government as part of Iran's global plan of conquest to create an Iran state. I'll get into that one other day, probably next year. That requires a bit of a whiteboard to get into that plan. It's pretty cool. But they basically argue that Iran's trying to cripple Saudi Arabia from underneath through taking over Yemen and making it a Shia state, then using Iran from the top and basically scrunching on Saudi Arabia, trying to turn into a Shia state, then eventually invading to Syria and Iraq, turning them over into Shia states, and eventually taking over the Middle East, then to Europe and becoming a Shia empire. Now that may sound a little bit far-fetched, but the idea of the Shia Houthis supporting the Iran supporting the Shia Houthis is not that far-fetched, because there has been evidence of some military work being done by the Iranians and Shia Houthis. However, the biggest ones of these allegations is Saudi Arabia. And in response to this, Saudi Arabia has now begun launching jets. They've had airstrikes now going on over the Shia Houthis. So right now, basically, we have an all-out civil war that's going on, plus two other nations. One for sure that's currently fighting, and then one that is currently in the process of allegations that it's fighting, but not really exactly confirmed that it's part of this conflict. So this is an interesting breed of civil war that we're seeing, where it's not just two separate groups of people, but two separate ideologies that have brought two other countries into war. And we got to see here is that does this erupt into a full Middle Eastern war? Because if you remember, really the only country that doesn't really have any Islamic ties is what we see here is in Israel. However, there are tons of countries nearby who have Islamic ties. You have Egypt, Sudan, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and we may have some conflict where they may be trying the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. They may have a Sunni Shia conflict. So it's very important to understand Iran's true agenda, especially looking at the nuclear deal right now that's going on. Iran seems to be having a bit of an agenda of its own, so that's something we need to watch out for, and make sure you guys are watching out for that. Right. Okay, guys, thanks for sticking with me. So now we're going to go on to Turkey. Turkey is one of the most northern parts of the Middle East. It's like one of the closest to the European area. Now, Turkey has a wonderfully illustrious history. I prefer to start off with the Byzantine Empire, which I feel is like really Turkey's kind of golden age. The Byzantine Empire was a part of the Roman Empire. It was the western part of the Roman Empire. No, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, my bad. Byzantine Empire was the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So even after the Roman Empire fell, the Byzantiums continued the empire for another 1,000 years or so, which is pretty cool. There are a lot of other conflicts between the two empires, like the Great Schism between Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Church, but that's a different story for a different time. But I like to start off with Constantinople. Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, is the capital of Turkey. It has a very illustrious history. It laid along the major trade routes of Asia. It was a massive trading hub, very rich city, very powerful country as well, very powerful empire. So now instead of going from Turkey, let's go a bit for fast forward a few years until we get to World War II. So World War II, this is where Turkey really started creating a lot of problems for itself. We start off with the Ottoman Turks. So, World War One, the Ottoman Turks were a government, or they were part of Turkey. They're Arabs, or Muslims, who were in control of Turkey. They were pretty strict, and it was very interesting. Their idea for entering, not World War II, sorry, World War One. My bad. I'm a derp. World War One was that they wanted to save their organization because a lot of people, they were not in favor with a lot of different people, a lot of different groups within Turkey. Because remember, this is an empire. There were a lot of sectarian groups within that were not happy with the Ottoman Turks and the way they were ruling. So because of this, they thought that if they supported Germany and Italy and all these guys with their fighting, specifically Germany, they could get a lot of help to keep their empire intact. It would also be able to allow them to assert their dominance over others. They could persecute a lot of their political enemies for war crimes, treason, all that fun stuff that they could do. So their idea was that they gave them a lot of power. However, of course, as we all know, Germany lost World War One, I believe rightly so, and the Ottoman Empire fell apart. Now we have present-day Turkey. So I like to call present-day Turkey, at least from around the 2000s, a bit of a pseudo-democracy. Now, if you guys don't understand what that means, I'm not talking North Korea where there's like no trace of a democracy. But I'm talking a bit more like Napoleon Bonaparte, the guy who said, "Oh, I got 99% of the vote," but in reality, he really couldn't get that much. But he's still pretty popular with the people. So let's first go to our first man we're going to talk about, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. I probably completely butchered that name. So this is the first part of my philosophy of a dictatorship that's basically democracy, but it has a bit of a dictatorship essence. He was prime minister for quite a long time. He was prime minister of Turkey from 2003 to 2014. But then, get this, from 2014 onwards until today, he is now the president. Now, doesn't that seem a little bit fishy? He goes from prime minister to president. So that's my first issue with the Turkish democratic idea. Second thing, there were in 2013 he had a lot of corruption charges, a lot of corruption arrests. That he was doing a lot of bad things. He was basically taking out political enemies. He was basically hiding them away. He was doing money laundering, embezzlement, all that fun stuff. And then also there were the 2013 Gezi Park protests, where basically people started to come together. They tried to have a small sit-in in defense for a small city park. But instead, because of the authoritarian rule, they ended up firing tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons at these poor people who just wanted to defend a park. It's like I get all you guys, right? I'm like, yo, Creekside Park. It's our place. We go play basketball there. It's awesome. Let's go sit in there. The city of Cupertino comes in with water cannons and tear gas. So that's the two parts that I want to talk about, Turkey and their authoritarian government. This is going to play an important part when we talk about current foreign relations with Turkey. So, a couple things you need to understand about Turkey, that it's incredibly proud of its culture. In case you guys didn't really know, it's kind of hard to say, but the anniversary, doesn't feel like a very correct word for this kind of thing, the anniversary of the Armenian, I consider it a genocide. The Armenian genocide occurred a few weeks past, and Turkey immediately began a massive thing. Armenia basically tried to have this whole day where they're like, yo, we had a genocide, it sucked a lot, and immediately Turkey got very angry. The Vatican actually didn't say genocide directly, but he basically suggested the idea of the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Turks. And immediately Turkey withdrew its ambassador from the Vatican in like the manner of like hours. The first time government was not effective. It sent out a bunch of proclamations, a bunch of commendations, a bunch of condemnations, and basically said, no, we didn't do genocide. So this is the first thing we need to see about authoritarian rule. However, this also gets more interesting with the US, because Turkey, surprisingly enough, is one of our NATO allies. That's right. Turkey is one of our NATO allies, and we all know how much the US loves NATO. So, in order for the US to be happy to stay in good relations with NATO and Turkey to be good with Turkey, it actually opted. Barack Obama got elected on one of his promises that he was going to ensure that the concept of the genocide of the Armenian people by the Turks was going to be constituted as a genocide, and he didn't do that, which actually irritated a lot of people when he got elected. But basically what happened is that because of these results, a lot of, not just the US, but a lot of European nations, a lot of other Middle Eastern nations refused to adjust to the idea of the Armenian genocide, and instead saying it was simply sickness and disease that killed off over 1 million Armenians. So yeah, that's the Armenian genocide. Now, if we go a bit more, we look more about our. I'm gonna give you guys another example. Some of you guys are really good at this, making use of jokes. I'm gonna give you an example of when Turkey was incredibly interesting in the way it reacted to a situation. Turkey is so proud of its power that it sent an armored convoy of 100 soldiers to recover a tomb within Iraq. That sounds very weird to you if you don't know what I'm talking about. Basically what happened is Turkey signed a contract with Iraq that there was this Turkish leader who was buried in Iraq. Basically they fly a Turkey flag there, they say it as Turkey's sovereign land, and they basically, I thought that the idea of ISIS coming in and basically destroying everything in its path was an attack on the sovereignty of Turkey, and a massive 100 men with an armored convoy to extract the grave and bring it back to Istanbul. what ended up happening, the grave got back and all that was good, but actually one service member actually died because he got hit by one of the trucks. That's how much Turkey cared for its thing. So Turkey is a very interesting idea in that regard, where also Turkey was very interesting in the fact of ISIS, because Turkey, if you guys don't know the geography of what's going on with ISIS and Iraq as Turkey, first of all, talk to me. I will bring you up to speed because I gave a lecture on that. Second, Turkey shares a border too with Iraq. On that border lives the Peshmerga fighters. They're a very I feel they're heroes who are currently fighting against ISIS. They're supporting the Yazidis, and they're basically Kurdish mega fighters who were actually kept by the Turkish government from actually entering into the conflict, despite Turkey's NATO's ties. So this is also very interesting that Turkey wishes to keep itself very neutral from the current conflicts in the world. So there you go. That's my recap of the Middle East. I'm thinking next time around we're going to do Asia. Let me know what you think about that. Asia is a bit interesting. I may do a quick thing on economics soon one day, just about what's going on. If you guys want to get a bit of a head start, I'd say start researching one thing, because I'm going to give you a fact. You may want to find out why this occurred. Japan now owns more U.S. debt than China. There you go. That means more than $1 trillion of U.S. debt is now in Japan. So that's all for now, guys. Thank you so much for coming. Make sure you keep practicing, getting ready for next year. Gonna do an awesome job. See you later, guys. Bye.